He despised my silence, shamed me for my autism. Then he got arrested, and I became the key witness. For the first time in my life, I spoke loudly, and everyone listened. Growing up, I was that kid who sat in the corner during family gatherings, watching everyone else laugh and talk while I stayed silent. Words felt heavy in my mouth, like they were made of concrete. My grandpa would look at me with this expression of pure disgust, shaking his head whenever I'd struggle to answer simple questions or avoid eye contact with relatives. The man had this way of making his disappointment known without even raising his voice. Every Sunday dinner was torture. The whole extended family would crowd into his dining room, and he'd make these comments about how I was different from other kids my age. He'd compare me to my cousins who were chatty and outgoing, always making sure I heard every word. The worst part wasn't even the comments themselves. It was watching my parents just sit there and take it. Nobody ever told him to stop. Nobody ever stood up for me. I remember one particular evening when I was around 12. We were all sitting around the table, and my aunt was talking about her son's baseball team. My grandpa turned to me and asked if I played any sports. I just shrugged because speaking felt impossible in that moment. He slammed his hand on the table, making all the dishes jump, and said those words that still echo in my head, "Son of a dog." What kind of grandson? That's the future we're looking at. The room went quiet, but not the kind of quiet I was comfortable with. This was the heavy, uncomfortable silence that comes after someone crosses a line. My mom looked down at her plate. My dad cleared his throat and changed the subject. I excused myself to the bathroom and stayed there for 20 minutes, just staring at my reflection and wondering what was so fundamentally wrong with me that my own grandfather couldn't stand to be around me. School wasn't much better. Teachers would call on me, and I'd freeze up completely. Other kids learned to ignore me pretty quickly. I had maybe one or two acquaintances, but calling them friends would be generous. I spent most lunch periods in the library, reading the same books over and over because they felt safer than trying to navigate conversations with my peers. The thing about being quiet is that people assume you're not paying attention, but the opposite was true for me. I noticed everything. I saw how my grandpa's demeanor would shift when certain neighbors came around. I watched him interact with the little girl from next door, how he'd always find excuses to be outside when she was playing in her yard. Something about the way he looked at her made my stomach turn, but I couldn't put it into words back then. When I was 15, things started escalating at home. My parents were fighting more, and I could tell it had something to do with my grandpa, though they never discussed it in front of me. There were hushed phone conversations that would stop the moment I walked into a room. My mom seemed increasingly on edge, jumping at every small sound. One evening, I was in my room doing homework when I heard raised voices downstairs. It wasn't unusual for my parents to argue, but this felt different. I crept to the top of the stairs and listened. They were talking about the neighbor girl, about concerns someone had raised, about whether they should say something. My dad kept mentioning how the family had been through enough already, how getting involved would only make things worse for everyone. That's when I realized other people had noticed what I'd been seeing. The way my grandpa positioned himself near children, the inappropriate comments he'd make that adults would awkwardly laugh off, the times I'd seen him follow kids with his eyes in ways that made my skin crawl. I wasn't imagining it, and I wasn't the only one who'd noticed. Update 1. 3 months later, everything exploded. I was getting ready for school when my mom burst into my room, her face pale and her hands shaking. She told me my grandpa had been arrested. The neighbor girl had finally told her parents what had been happening, and they'd gone straight to the police. The next few weeks were a blur of family meetings, phone calls, and whispered conversations. Relatives took sides immediately. Some believed the accusations, others insisted it was all a misunderstanding or outright lies. My grandpa's supporters were vocal about their certainty that this was some kind of setup, that someone had it out for him. What shocked me most was how quickly some family members turned on the victim. They questioned why she'd waited so long to speak up, why her story had certain details that seemed unclear, why she couldn't remember exact dates. I sat through these discussions feeling sick to my stomach, remembering all the times I'd wanted to speak up about things I'd witnessed but couldn't find the words. The preliminary hearings started, and our family was falling apart. People were choosing sides, old grudges were surfacing, and everyone seemed to have an opinion about what really happened. My parents were trying to stay neutral, which mostly meant they avoided talking about it altogether. Then came the news that changed everything. The prosecutor's office called our house. They needed witnesses, people who might have observed concerning behavior. They specifically wanted to talk to family members who'd spent significant time around my grandpa. My parents immediately said they couldn't help. They claimed they'd never seen anything inappropriate. But I had. I'd seen plenty. The prosecutor explained that they needed someone who could testify about my grandpa's behavior patterns, his interactions with children, anything that might support the victim's account. When my parents refused to get involved, the prosecutor asked if there was anyone else in the family who might have relevant information. That's when my mom mentioned me, almost as an afterthought. She told them I was often around during family gatherings, but probably hadn't noticed anything because I was in my own world most of the time. The prosecutor asked to speak with me anyway. The interview was terrifying. I sat in this sterile office with a detective and the prosecutor, both of them looking at me expectantly. They asked about specific incidents, about conversations I might have overheard, about times I'd seen my grandpa interact with the neighbor girl or other children. For the first time in my life, my observations mattered. All those moments I'd filed away, all those uncomfortable feelings I'd never been able to articulate, suddenly they were important. The detective took notes while I described what I'd witnessed. My voice was shaky and I had to stop several times, but they waited patiently for me to continue. When I finished, the prosecutor leaned forward and said something that hit me like a truck. She told me I might be their strongest witness because I'd been watching when everyone else was distracted by conversations and social dynamics. My tendency to observe rather than participate had given me a unique perspective on my grandpa's behavior. They asked if I'd be willing to testify at trial. The question hung in the air for what felt like hours. I thought about my family, about the chaos this would cause, about my grandpa's supporters who would certainly see me as a traitor. But I also thought about that little girl, about how scared she must have been, about how many people were doubting her story. I said yes. Update 2. The backlash was immediate and brutal. Word spread through our family that I was cooperating with the prosecution, and suddenly I went from being the invisible kid to being public enemy number one. Relatives who'd barely acknowledged my existence before were calling the house, demanding to know what lies I was planning to tell. My grandpa's sister showed up at our door one evening, screaming at my parents about how they were raising a traitor, how I was destroying the family for attention. She looked directly at me and said I was finally finding my voice for all the wrong reasons. The irony wasn't lost on me. The same people who'd spent years criticizing my silence were now furious that I planned to speak. Extended family members started avoiding us. Invitations to gatherings stopped coming. My parents were caught in the middle, trying to support me while also dealing with the pressure from relatives who wanted them to convince me to back out of testifying. The worst part was the doubt that crept in during quiet moments. I'd lie awake at night wondering if I was remembering things correctly, if my perceptions were accurate, if I was about to destroy an old man's life based on observations that might be meaningless. The pressure to stay quiet, to go back to being invisible, was overwhelming. But then I'd remember specific incidents that were undeniably wrong. Like the time I'd seen my grandpa corner the neighbor girl by the fence between our yards, standing too close while she clearly tried to back away. Or the inappropriate comments he'd make about young girls' appearances, comments that made adults uncomfortable but that they'd brush off rather than confront. The prosecution team prepared me for testimony over several sessions. They explained what questions I'd be asked, how the defense might try to discredit me, what the courtroom would look like. They were patient with my speech difficulties, helping me practice articulating my observations clearly. One thing they emphasized was that my autism wasn't a weakness in this situation, it was actually an advantage. My attention to detail, my memory for specific incidents, my tendency to notice things others missed, these were strengths. For the first time in my life, someone was telling me that the way my brain worked wasn't a defect. As the trial date approached, the family pressure intensified. Relatives who'd never shown interest in my well-being suddenly wanted to have heart-to-heart conversations about family loyalty, about not airing dirty laundry in public, about the importance of standing by blood relations. My grandpa's defense team even approached my parents about having me declared an unreliable witness due to my autism. They argued that my social difficulties made me prone to misinterpreting normal interactions. When my parents told me about this, I felt that familiar shame creeping back in, the same feeling I'd had during all those family dinners when my grandpa would point out everything wrong with me. But something had shifted. Instead of retreating into silence, I found myself getting angry. These people had spent years treating me like I was broken, like my perspective didn't matter, like I was too damaged to contribute anything meaningful. Now they wanted to use those same perceived deficits to silence me when my voice might actually help someone. 3 days before the trial, my grandpa's son, my uncle, came to our house for what he called a man-to-man conversation. He sat across from me at our kitchen table and tried to convince me that testifying would haunt me for the rest of my life, that I'd never be welcome at family events again, that I was choosing strangers over blood. He painted a picture of my grandpa as a lonely old man whose life was being destroyed by false accusations, whose family was abandoning him when he needed them most. He talked about how testifying would make me the villain in this story, how people would always remember me as the grandson who betrayed his own grandfather. Then he said something that made my decision crystal clear. He told me that even if some of the things I'd witnessed were inappropriate, that didn't make my grandpa a criminal. He said that sometimes old men get confused about boundaries, that it wasn't malicious, that destroying his life over misunderstandings was cruel and unnecessary. That's when I understood that this wasn't about family loyalty or protecting my grandpa's reputation. This was about protecting the family's reputation at the expense of a child who'd been hurt. They were asking me to stay silent not because they believed my grandpa was innocent, but because they believed maintaining the family image was more important than justice. Final update. The day of my testimony, I woke up feeling like I might throw up. My parents drove me to the courthouse in complete silence. The building was intimidating, all marble and high ceilings, and people in expensive suits walking around with purpose. When they called my name, I walked to the witness stand on legs that felt like they might give out at any moment. I could see my grandpa sitting at the defense table, looking smaller and older than I remembered. Some family members were in the gallery, their faces ranging from supportive to openly hostile. The prosecutor started with basic questions: my name, my age, my relationship to the defendant. My voice was quiet, and the judge asked me to speak up. That simple request felt monumental. For years, people had been telling me to speak up, but they'd never really wanted to hear what I had to say. Then came the harder questions. The prosecutor walked me through specific incidents I'd witnessed, asking for details about dates, locations, who else was present. With each answer, I could feel the weight of family disapproval pressing down on me, but I kept talking. The defense attorney was brutal during cross-examination. He questioned my memory, my interpretation of events, my ability to accurately assess social situations. He suggested that my autism made me prone to misunderstanding normal grandfather-granddaughter interactions. He painted me as a confused young man who'd been manipulated by prosecutors into believing innocent behavior was sinister. But something unexpected happened during the cross-examination. Instead of retreating into silence like I always had when people attacked my credibility, I found myself getting clearer and more determined. Each attempt to dismiss my observations made me more certain that I needed to be heard. When the defense attorney asked if I was sure I hadn't misunderstood what I'd seen, I looked directly at him and said yes, I was sure. When he suggested that my social difficulties made me an unreliable narrator, I explained that those same difficulties meant I'd learned to watch people carefully, to notice details that others missed. The turning point came when he asked why I'd never spoken up before if I'd really witnessed concerning behavior. It was a fair question, and one I'd asked myself many times. I thought about all the family dinners where I'd sat in silence while my grandpa made comments that made me uncomfortable. I thought about the years of being told that my perspective didn't matter, that my observations weren't valuable. I told the court that I'd been taught my whole life that my voice didn't matter, that my way of seeing the world was wrong, that I should stay quiet because I didn't understand things the way other people did. I explained that it had taken me 17 years to realize that being different didn't mean being wrong, that my observations were valid even if I struggled to express them. When I finished testifying, I felt completely drained but also strangely lighter. I'd said everything I needed to say. I'd given that little girl's story the support it deserved. Whatever happened next was out of my hands. The jury deliberated for 2 days. When they returned with a guilty verdict, I felt a complex mix of relief and sadness. Relief that justice had been served, that the victim had been believed. Sadness that it had come to this, that my family was fractured, that my grandpa would spend his remaining years in prison. The family fallout was exactly what I'd expected. Some relatives cut contact completely. Others maintained relationships with my parents but made it clear I wasn't welcome. A few, surprisingly, reached out to say they supported my decision, that they'd had their own concerns but hadn't known how to address them. My relationship with my parents changed too. They were proud of me for finding my voice, but they struggled with the family dynamics my testimony had created. We all had to learn how to navigate this new reality where I wasn't the quiet kid in the corner anymore. The most unexpected change was in how I saw myself. For 17 years, I believed that my silence was a weakness, that my difficulty with social interactions made me less valuable than other people. But testifying taught me that my voice had power, that my perspective mattered, that I didn't need to be perfect at communication to be heard. I started speaking up more in everyday situations. When teachers asked questions in class, I raised my hand even if my answer wasn't perfectly articulated. When family members made comments that bothered me, I responded instead of staying silent. When friends suggested activities that made me uncomfortable, I said so instead of just going along. It wasn't easy. I still struggled with social anxiety, still had moments where words felt impossible to find. But I learned something crucial. My voice didn't need to be perfect to be valuable. I didn't need to sound like everyone else to deserve to be heard. The neighbor girl's family moved away about 6 months after the trial. Before they left, her mother stopped by our house to thank me. She said that my testimony had been crucial in helping the jury understand the pattern of behavior, that it had validated her daughter's account in a way that made all the difference. She told me that her daughter was doing better, that she was getting the help she needed, that she was starting to trust adults again. Knowing that my decision to speak up had played a part in her healing made everything worth it. The family drama, the lost relationships, the years of being seen as the traitor who broke up the family. 2 years later, I'm in college now, studying social work. I want to help other kids who feel voiceless, who think their perspective doesn't matter, who've been taught that being different means being wrong. I still struggle with social situations sometimes, still have days where words feel heavy and difficult. But I know now that my voice has value, that my observations matter, that staying silent isn't always the safe choice. My grandpa died in prison last year. I didn't go to the funeral. Some family members see this as final proof of my heartlessness, but I've made peace with their judgment. I learned that sometimes speaking up means losing people you thought you needed, but it also means finding parts of yourself you didn't know existed. The quiet kid who used to sit in the corner during family dinners is gone. In his place is someone who understands that voices come in different forms, that being heard doesn't require being loud, that sometimes the most important words are the hardest ones to say. I found my voice by standing up for someone who needed it, and I plan to keep using it for as long as I can.